Welcome back, and hopefully you enjoyed that lab. So now it's time to cover lesson number 3. And as you can see here, this lesson is called HCI Mesh Interoperability. So let's take a look at the goals for this particular lesson. Over the next few minutes, what I want to do is explain the relationship between HCI Mesh and HA. I want to do the same thing when it comes to HCI Mesh or Remote vSAN and SPBM. I'm talking about virtual machine storage policies. Number 3, I've already shown you my demo that you could always storage vMotion your VMs from one cluster and of course one data store to the same cluster and a second different data store. You better believe you could also migrate a VM. I'm talking about vMotion, cross-cluster vMotion. That is compatible. And then lastly, we'll talk about the relationship between HCI Mesh and DRS. So let's take a look at this page. In this page, we're showing you different potential issues that you may encounter one day. If you look at the 3 bullets, what we're showing you here, number 1, is a network partition in the server cluster. Number 2, a network partition in the client cluster. And then lastly, loss of connectivity between the client and server clusters. I want to talk about number 3 in particular. Imagine out of the blue, your VM is running on, let's say, cluster number 1. And for whatever reason, cluster number 1 no longer sees the data store belonging to cluster number 2. What do we do about that? What do we expect? And that's what they mention on the next page. So in this page, we know that when we build a vSAN cluster, we need HA. HA is in charge of restarting the VMs. Now, historically, we don't use VMCP with vSAN because, again, typically this is for remote storage, external shared storage. Now, for the first time ever, now we're talking about having a vSAN cluster with not only his data store, but also a remote one. So what they're telling you on this page is that you should, in this case, enable and configure VMCP, Virtual Machine Component Protection. Now, what they try to tell you here is that out of the blue, if you have a problem and you don't get to see the remote vSAN data store anymore, at that point, what's going to happen is you're going to have an all path down situation, an APD situation. And if you look at the last 2 statements in this page, notice it says, when the cross-cluster communication fails, an APD situation is going to be declared automatically after 60 seconds. Now, if you look at the last paragraph, it says an APD response is going to be triggered to automatically restart the virtual machines after 3 minutes or 180 seconds. Now, when we look at this page, this goes back to my previous demo. In my previous demo, I showed you what would happen if you tried to, for example, storage vMotion, a RAID 5 VM, onto the data store belonging to a 3-node cluster. And you saw, of course, that that failed. Now, why did it fail? Because remember, you have one vCenter. You have one VASA provider. And if you think about it, with HCI Mesh, the vCenter now is aware not only, of course, of the requirements of the VM, but also the fact that this VM is trying to move, let's say, to the data store belonging to a host that does not have enough full domains. So just like I showed you that it would fail with storage vMotion, imagine if I go to my 5-node cluster, I decide to create a RAID 5 VM, but I decide to store it on the remote vSAN data store. Would that work? And the answer is, of course not. Once again, as you can see here, you have one VASA provider. And again, it is still one cluster and one VASA provider. Now, when you take a look at this page, here they continue talking about SPBM and its relationship with HCI Mesh. So notice it says additional points about storage policy-based management operations with HCI Mesh clusters. And here you have 2 bullets. Notice it says only hosts in the server cluster can respond to SPVM commands. And notice number 2, vSAN and VASA provider ignores the client cluster hosts. Now, when you take a look at this page, remember, I've already done a demo where I showed you that yes, storage vMotion is compatible with HCI mesh, as long as, of course, the VM uses a policy that can be satisfied by the second vSAN data store. So here what they tell you is that if you want, you can storage vMotion a VM. You could also vMotion a VM. So I'm going to do another demo perhaps. And again, I'll show you maybe what happens if I try to create a VM on a remote data store. And again, we don't have enough full domains, similar to my previous demo. And again, we'll do some kind of vMotion operations. Finally, here they talk about the relationship between remote vSAN and vSphere DRS. So if you think about it, we know that DRS is the automation of vMotion. So let's say I have a 5-node cluster. Now let's say I decide to migrate a VM from the first host in that cluster to the second host in that cluster. If that VM resides on a remote vSAN data store, will that work? And the answer is yes. I mean, after all, if I can manually vMotion, why wouldn't I be able to automate that? So on that note, that takes care of lesson number 3. Once again, I'm going to do one more demo, and then we're done with this chapter. Thank you, guys. I'll see you in a few.